Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at, again, the fifth chapter of White Fragility, page 78 if you're following along. I don't mind people that dislike videos. I actually think that you have every right to dislike anything you dislike. But I do ask that if you dislike something, I request, if you can, to tell me why, just to understand your point of view. It doesn't mean we're going to agree, but I do like to try to understand other people's points of view. And if they think I'm wrong about something, or they think that I'm missing something, I'd like to hear it. On the other hand, what I find about this is funny is she doesn't like to hear anything or ever think she may be wrong about anything. In my work to unravel the dynamics of racism, I found a question that never fails me. The question is not if this claim is true or is it false. We will never come to an agreement on a question that sets up an either-or dichotomy on something as sensitive as racism. Instead, I ask, how does this claim function in the conversation? If we apply this question to those two sets of narratives, one colorblind and the other color celebrate, we see that these claims ultimately function in a similar way. They all exempt the person from any responsibility for or participation in the problem. They take the race off the table, and they close rather than open any other further exploration. In doing so, they protect the racial status quo. Does anybody see a problem with that narrative? In other words, I don't question whether or not I'm right or wrong. I don't question whether or not this is happening. I just ask, how are you doing this? This way we don't avoid the entire problem of seeing if it's right or wrong or not. So that's why I don't say or ask, is Robert DiAngelo anti-Semitic or actually Arab, because she doesn't talk about Islamophobia in this book at all. So she is an Islamophobe by her definition, and she doesn't fight Islamophobia in this book. Therefore, she is perpetuating it and part of the system of Islamophobia. So by that definition, or Islamophobic ideology, we don't question whether or not she's Islamophobic, because that would be a problem. We just assume she is and ask, in what way does it manifest itself? These typical white racial claims depend on the underlying framework of meaning. Identifying this framework can help us to understand how we can manage and make such claims in the context of extreme segregation and racial inequality. Now again, people segregate and have their segments of population, and there is racial inequality, as I mentioned, among whites. As I mentioned, Russians have a lot more millionaires and have more money per capita than people from England descent. So does that mean there's systematic racism against English people in reference to Russian privilege? Because if we're taking a look at that's the definition, then you could break down each group and start defining them and start looking for privilege within each group, because there is differences in the framework. That in itself does not tell you what's the cause. And of course, she's not interested in the cause because she just assumes the cause. And that's the problem with the mindset. Imagine a pier stretching out over the water, viewed from above. The pier appears to simply float there. The top of the pier, the part we can see, signifies the surface aspect of these claims. Yet while the pier seems to float effortlessly, it is of course not floating at all. It is propped up by structures submerged under the water. The pier rests on pillars embedded in the ocean floor. It is the same way that pier sits on submerged pillars that are not immediately visible. The beliefs supported in our racial claims are hidden from our view. To topple the pier, we need to access and uproot the pillars. Well, she's also wrong about that. There's something called a floating pier, where the nature of what it is, as long as it's tied together, will float. So this idea that yes, there are piers built that are things like that, and then you have floating piers, but she doesn't even give the ability for a floating pier to exist, because all piers are the same. The above claims are meant to provide evidence of the speaker's lack of racism. For example, in a conversation about racism, when white people say they work in a diverse environment, or they have people of color in their family, they're giving me evidence that they're not racist. If this is their evidence, how are they defining racism? In other words, what underlying system of meaning leads them to make that claim? If working near people of color is the evidence that distinguishes them from a racist, then evidently a racist cannot work near people of color. This claim rests on a definition of racism as conscious intolerance. That was actually what racism was for a long time. The inability for people of a different ethnicity or race, white only drinking fountains. This is, you can't eat here, you can't be here. The nature was, there was a segregation based upon keeping our area free of those people. If you marry somebody who is not of your ethnicity, you cannot claim then that person is racist against that ethnicity he married into. That is just insane. You can state that the person may be a person of his character defects and says things that are wrong, but to state that person is not racist, the person still is racist, despite that he married somebody of that color and loves them dearly, that would be a really irrational type of argument. And just to help you out with this, people that are anti-Semitic don't want to be near Jews. They want to stay away from them. They like them dead, for the most part. People that are Islamophobic don't want people like that around them. They want them far away from them. People in the Nation of Islam do not want to be near white people. They want to keep them far away. So this ideology that she's saying somehow that the nature of not caring if a person is near you has no bearing to the way they feel about you is just not rational. A racist is someone who presumably cannot tolerate even the sight of a person of color. According to this logic, because you know they work with people of color or lived in New York, or where they saw people of color all around them and have spoken with and smiled at people of color, they cannot participate in racism. No, I wouldn't agree with that. Because there is external idea of racism, where you could smile at the person and say, I really hate your guts and you're really a piece of garbage and I wish you were out of here. Or you could really have the idea that you don't see that person and do not hold any prejudice against that person and act on it. That would not mean you were not racist against that person, at least by the original definitions of what these words meant. Again, they're trying to redefine them in a way that doesn't even make sense. They're just saying there's inequity. So there's inequity, it's racism. And if it's racism, you're participating on it. But there is no system that doesn't create inequity. There is no equity system in this world. It doesn't exist in any country or any society. Any society or any country you go to, you're going to find inequity among groups and then intergroups. So the nature and the notion that just because there's inequity, therefore it's racism, doesn't make sense. When you go beneath the surface of these claims, we can see their superficiality. For even an avid white nationalist who would march openly in the streets chanting blood and soil can interact with people of color and very likely do so. Yes, they can interact with people of color because they would go to jail or otherwise have issues. They would not marry into people of color. They're not going to be friends with people of color. It's very interesting because Daryl Davis actually befriended people from the Klan. And when he did and actually became friends with them, they gave up the robes and disavowed the Klan. Because the nature of the friendship made them learn something. But this is what she doesn't seem to understand. In fact, I have seen black reporters interviewing open and avowed white supremacists on television, with both parties proceeding calmly and respectfully. Yes, and the white person will turn to the black person and say, you are inferior to me. Because just the idea of that, as long as you're not trying to take my power away from me, I could respect that. But basically, if they could, they would want to do a lot of bad things to that person. It's just the nature of the law and the way that the world works. They know they can't. The reason why the Klan members wore hoods is because they were doing things that were illegal and didn't want to be identified. So this idea that she has, that just because they can play nice on the surface, therefore then it's the same as anybody else treating somebody, is just not true again. It's looking at an idea of, I want to be with you and care about you as a person. You are my friend. I would give you the shirt off my back, to I will tolerate you for this interview, but really, I'm going to go back and tell all my friends that I had to just, and then be disparaging and talking horrible about you afterwards. That's not the same thing. But again, why do we have to care about reality? Those who claim to have been taught to treat everybody the same are simply telling me they don't understand socialization. It is not possible to teach someone who treats everyone the same. We can be told often and told to treat everybody the same, but we cannot be successful to be taught to do the same because human beings are not objective. Now, I will share that in my evaluations over the course of many, many years, over 23, what's interesting is that all the supervisors I've ever had stated that I was objective in clinical thought process in reference to any system of clients. What I mean by that is that I have a general set of principles that I work by, and I don't care who the clinician that is bringing up the case. I have the same set of principles nonetheless. Because there are people, depending on who brings up the case, certain people will go along with it and other people won't. And in my evals, it was always based upon principle. And the reason why it is because it's objective. So if I see a white person or I see a black person doing the same thing, I think the same thing should happen to both of them. It doesn't make a difference who it is. If it was my brother, the same principle should apply. I don't believe in the favoritism concept. I think it actually destroys society. So I think the rules should be fair, but should apply to everybody equally. And it should be that simple. The problem is that when we start making reasons and we start getting into the mind frame, we start to then justify, and that does lead to the issue of lack of objectivity becoming subjective and starting to create more disparity. This is the reason why I love the idea of vehicular manslaughter, 15 years for anybody that does it. And people should not be able to get away with it no matter what the situation was. Vehicular manslaughter is vehicular manslaughter. If you did the crime, you do the time. Further, we would not want to treat everyone the same because people have different needs and different relationships with us. Now that's the problem. Now, we should want to treat people the same. Now, it is true that there'll be different relationships. Meaning, if I have an African-American brother-in-law or I have a white brother-in-law, I should treat them both the same. Meaning in reference that they're brother-in-laws. Now, one might need a loan and the other might not need a loan. One might need a gift and the other might not need a gift. But the nature of the way I treat them should not be different. And I shouldn't say, well, if it's the white one, I'm going to give him more. And if it's the black one or African-American one, I won't. That's a problem. That would be a racist tendency. So the nation of treating everybody the same is nonsense, but the nature of the relationship to you is not. You don't treat all women the same, right? You'll go over to your wife and you expect certain things from your wife. You don't go to your next door neighbor and start expecting her to act like your wife. It's just not the way, right? It's that you understand that the relationship that you have with that person is different. But if your wife was white or your wife was black, I'm assuming that most of us would treat them the same as your wife if they were your wife. You wouldn't go, well, I have a white wife, so therefore I treat her better than if I had a black wife. I hope that most people would not do that. And I don't think most people would. Differential treatment in itself is not the problem. For example, I would give a document with a 12-point font to a person with low vision, even though someone else who has trouble reading it. The problem is misinformation that circulates around us and causes our differential treatment to be inequitable. No, the aspect is as if that if I'm giving somebody that font difference, the question is, why am I doing it? Is it a matter of, does it give an advantage? Does it give a disadvantage? In other words, why am I doing what I'm doing? Does it have meaning? Meaning for the person that's 12, then the person that doesn't have the issue when you increase the size, is it going to 46? So that they have some sort of advantage that you're giving them. Because that makes a difference. The feedback I've heard repeatedly from people of color is that when they hear a white person claim to have been taught to treat everyone the same, they are not thinking, all right, I'm now talking to a woke white person. Quite the opposite. Some version of eye rolling is taking place at the sight of the white person, off as unaware, and brace themselves for another exchange based in white denial and invalidation. First of all, nobody should be invalidating anybody. People can have differing points of view and different thought process. That doesn't mean you invalidate somebody else's. As a culture, we don't claim that gender roles are gender conditioned to disappear the moment we love someone of the opposite gender. Actually, that's exactly how it happened. You see, earlier on in the book, she talks about the women's suffrage movement and that women had to wait for men to give them the right to vote. but she doesn't acknowledge that it was because women wanted it that actually created that. And the perception is that more women wanted it, and it changed the minds of the men who then voted for it. And when women actually voted for it, they actually were against it. But that's the problem. She doesn't care about that. If women wanted the right to vote from the inception of the country, let me phrase that. When women got the right to vote, when men got the right to vote, and women wanted it at that point, they could have gotten it at that point. How? They would have gone to their husbands who loved them and cared about them and explained what they wanted and why. The nature of the sexual roles were not broken down because women were like, oh my God, we just are under this spell. We can't do anything about this. And if you know anything about the history, women have taken many strong and positive roles to change society during that time period. They were very politically active in a lot of different ways, just not the vote. Because to them, the vote was tied at that point, and actually a lot of women thought that would happen. If they got the vote, they would have to be drafted into the army, and they didn't want that. So the nature of this idea that somehow when a man loves a woman, he's not any more likely or less likely to see sexism. I think men that have more daughters are going to be more likely, in which you'll see who's been fighting for equality all this time period that we've gone through in society. And that's been because women have wanted that change to take place, not always for the best, by the way. Women today actually report a much lower sense of self-satisfaction than historically. So it's not a matter of like somehow women are getting this and somehow it's leading to better results. It's actually not in a lot of ways. But regardless of that, what women have fought for, they've generally gotten. And it generally happens pretty quickly when it's not even the majority, even when there's a strong minority, they've gotten it, which has caused another issue. Because I'm married to a man, I have a gender-free free life. And the answer is no, but you do see women differently as when you care and love one than if you don't. And that's just the nature of the way it works. We understand that gender is a very deep social construct, and we have different experiences depending on our gender roles. Yes, for a lot of men who love their wives, they still maintain gender roles. And that doesn't mean they're negating them. They see the role as being something positive. And assignments and expressions, and that we will wrestle with these differences throughout our life and our relationships. When the topic is race, we claim that we're completely inoperative in that if they are any level of fond regard. In an even more ludicrous form of reality, we go as far as to claim that racial conditioning disappears if we can calmly walk by people of color of the streets in large circles. No, it's not by walking by them in large circles that makes you not racially. It's the idea that I have an interpersonal, deep relationship with them. That does. Being married to one. That's not the same as walking by them. While the implication that a racist cannot tolerate knowing, working next to, or walking among people of color is rather ridiculous, no, it's not. It actually was for a long period of time. And the idea of being on the bus, no, I want you on a different bus. And the idea of putting them in the back of the bus was still horrible for them, but they tolerated it. So this idea that somehow this is like this crazy, again, without knowing history. The sad fact that many whites have no cross-racial friendships at all. And that's true. That doesn't make them racist either. It has to do with whether or not you've had the experience, whether or not somebody wants to be friends with you. Perhaps this is why we rely on flimsy evidence to certify ourselves as racism-free. But even those that have cross-racial friendships and use that as evidence for the lack of racism still invoke the binary of racist bad/not racist equals good binary. They see their friendships as proof that they are not racist side of the binary. Yet cross-racial friendships do not block out the dynamics of racism in our society at large, and these dynamics continue unabated. The white person will still receive white privilege that a friend of color does not. Okay, let's assume for a minute the things that we agree upon that people of white privilege get, and say, okay, that's true. A police officer may treat you differently. You may be heard differently by another person because of that. That is absolutely true. That could happen. That means the person listening is the racist. The person that does that in the position of power is the racist. Can the person who's not racist stop the racist from acting racist? And the answer is they can't. So the locus of control is not me controlling the police officers to not act a certain way towards somebody or to treat somebody with respect. The problem is I have no control over that. Now, would I say that needs to change? Would I go out and vote for people who are not going to change that? Yes. Would I want that to be different? Absolutely. But that's my locus of control. What she's talking about here is because you are the recipient of something, therefore now you are culpable in it. And that's untrue. If my great-grandfather was a bank robber and then money was left to me through a laundered account, because if they ever got the money, boom, through a laundered account, I am not culpable in the bank robbery, even though I got the benefit of it. And that's a mistake in the ideology over here as well. And these dynamics continue unabated. The white person will still receive white privilege that a friend of color does not, even though those people engage in these activities together. Nor does the friendship block out all the messages that we have internalized and that are reinforced in their society. I agree. The relationship and the messages of society are still going to be there. In fact, racism invariably manifests itself within cross-racial friendships as well. Okay, she's saying that you're still racist against your friend. Racism cannot be absent from your friendship. So no matter how many friends you have, no matter whether or not you're married to your wife, you're racist against her according to this logic. Few people of color who have ever met said this racism isn't at play in their friendships with white people. Some whites are more thoughtfully aware and receptive to feedback than others, but no cross-racial relationship is free from the dynamics of racism in this society. Well, by her definition, she is then a racist herself, and you can't listen to her, because she, in her racism, because she's a white person, has had in this book cross-cultural relationships where she invited friends over to places that they didn't want to go with her, and I'm getting more of the reason why they didn't want to go with her, and it had nothing to do with her race. But the nature of what she's talking about here is that she herself would always have to be racist in them on some level. And if that's the case and you can never stop it, then what's the point? Many whites believe that they're not talking about racism within their friends of color or in their friends, and they're not giving them feedback about racism, then racism is a non-issue. But just because you and your friend don't talk about racism doesn't mean it isn't at play. But let's say you do talk about racism. Indeed, this is silence in one of the many ways that racism is manifested. And by the way, if your friend does talk to you about racism, and then you have 7 other friends that talk to you about racism, and then they all have different opinions on it, which one do you listen to? See, when I run groups with people, primarily African Americans, not that everybody is, but majority, and there's 25 people in the room, African Americans don't agree with each other on all issues, including on race. So if you have 7 African Americans and 4 are saying this, and 2 are saying this, and 2 are saying this, which is the ones that are going to lead you to the less racism one, or the less racist ideology? Indeed, this silence is one of the ways racism is manifest. For his imposed silence, many people of color have told me they initially tried to talk about racism with their white friends, but their friends got defensive or invalidated their experiences, so they stopped sharing their experiences. If racism is not a topic of discussion between a white person or a person of color who are friends, their absence of the conversation may indicate a lack of cross-racial trust. There's no doubt in my mind racism exists. There's no doubt in my mind there have been people I've worked with that have experienced racism. No doubt. The nature, though, of hard definitions here are so out of bounds in terms of that, because one is invalidating the person's experience, which you can't do. I mean, that's what she doesn't seem to understand. When you're working with somebody, you don't invalidate their experiences. You actually hear them out. And you try to understand them. That doesn't necessitate that every experience they have is racist. The good-bad binary is powerful and enduring. It's what follows. I offer counter-narratives to a few of its most popular claims. Notice how each of these claims labels the person making them as not racist, thereby examining them from further involvement or responsibility. I was taught to treat everybody the same. As I explained above, no one can be taught to treat people equitably. I don't agree with that, because humans cannot be 100% objective. 100% no. But if you're 97% objective, that's pretty damn good. For example, I could lecture you for hours that this is not nice to judge, and no one likes to be judged. And believe me, if she lectured me for hours, I'd be judging the lecture, because the nature of which she attempts to do this is horrific. You wouldn't want to be judged, would you? Actually, that's not true. I like judgment. One of the things I do on YouTube is put myself out there to be judged. To be judged on what I'm presenting, thoughts that I'm saying, to be asked whether or not you agree or disagree with me. And if you noticed, I love responding to the disagreements. Why? Because it helps sharpen what's true. Whether it's a good argument or not, whether or not you're making a good argument or not, whether I could be wrong. I'm not afraid of being wrong. What I am afraid of, somebody's telling me with something called pathological certainty. No evidence, making assertions, no understanding of history, being wrong on a whole bunch of issues doesn't make a difference, and then being a New York Times bestseller. And so on. At the end of the lecture, you would still continue to judge, because it's possible not to. We try to examine our judgments, hold them more light and so forth, and be free of judgment. Not possible. Nor can we treat everybody the same. Indeed, the person professing to treat everybody the same is stating a personal value, but the claim closes off another reflection. Once we understand the power of implicit bias, for example, we know that we must deepen rather than close off further reflection. Although deeper reflection won't free us from unconscious, inequitable treatment of others, it will get us closer than we will out of outright denial. By the way, she's absolutely wrong. The studies done on implicit bias shows there's no correlational effect to the way that somebody treats somebody else in their objective patterns. Meaning, the more that somebody shows implicit bias, there's no showing that it has any effect on what they do to that other person in terms of their action. And that's what the studies show. But again, she doesn't care about the social science. I marched in the 60s. Someone who tells me I marched in the 60s like a person who tells me they know people of color. It's telling me they see racism as a simple matter of racial intolerance, which clearly they don't have, or they could not have tolerated marching alongside black people during the civil rights movement. They're also telling me that they believe that racism is uncomplicated and unchanging. Yet in the 1960s, we thought race was biological. We used terms like Oriental and colored. Nevertheless, in light of the action, they took more than 50 years ago to see the racial learnings are finished for life. And by the way, those terms would still be used today if that's what people wanted. The nature of the changing of the terms means absolutely nothing. She's just trying to say we can just change any definition we like because it changes terms. I think it's, again, a very irrational argument. The action certifies them as free of racism, and there's no more discussion or reflection required. No, you could do something that is not racist, and then later on do something that's very racist. It's not an if or and binary. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't see racist people as being evil. I see them as being ignorant. Again, very similar to the way that Mr. Green sees them. And that's the point I was trying to get Daryl. So the point is that's the point is so important to understand. So this idea that if somebody were to say, you know, man, that was a racist remark, or I didn't like that remark, or I found it to be racist, I absolutely want to hear that. That would be something I want somebody to tell me. It's happened before. And I'm not defensive or going, what? No. I first want to hear, what is it that I said that made you think that? Right? First question. More often than not, it gets resolved and there's either a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation, and it was never even said. Because there's two aspects of somebody's perception. There is my ability to be objective in thought, and there's also the other person to interpret what the event took place. Right? So it's not only mine, the other person also has a role in that. And just like she says objectivity is not 100%, neither is perception. Honey, how do I look in this? You look good. It's horrible. You didn't say great. So the perception of the event can cloud how you view what you hear. It also assumes that absolutely no racism, even unconsciously, was perpetrated toward blacks by well-meaning whites during the civil rights movement. No, I don't agree with that. It's very possible that somebody could be trying to help in terms of that civil rights movement and still have had a racial ideology or thought process. But they were much less likely that to happen. And also, you'd have to actually show how they did, or if they did. You can't just say, I didn't like this, therefore it's racist. Yet these testimonies of black civil rights activists tell us otherwise. How many white people who marched in the 1960s had authentic cross-racial relations with the African Americans? She's right. Many people had superficial ones. Certainly there was and still is racial segregation throughout the North. Perhaps not as explicitly enforced, but certainly enforced implicitly in countless ways. Perhaps many of those white Northerners who came down to the South to save black people had some patronizing or condescending attitudes. Possible. Might many have dominated discussions, not listened to others, and assumed to know what was best? Now that is not racist. That's ego. See, there you go again. Was the reason why that person did that because they were black? Or would they have done that with a group of whites? But again, the assumption is if they did that with a black person, they must be racist. That's insane. There are white people in white groups that act like, you know the word. And their egos take over. And they want to do everything their way because they think it's the best. That doesn't make them racist against white people. It just makes them who they are as a person. Did they say many racial problematic things that Southern blacks were forced to endure? Had I been old enough, I probably would have marched in the 60s, and yet, as far as into the 90s, I was saying and doing racially problematic things. I think you're still doing racially problematic things. Although I do them less often and less blatantly today. I don't believe that. I still do them. Again, the claim that someone is not racist because the person marched in the 60s rests on the simplistic definition of racism as a conscious intolerance of black people. And again, it's a intolerance and a statement of inferiority. Again, you could disagree with a black person and not be racist. You could think a black person is wrong in their thinking process and not be racist. You could say to a black person that I don't agree with you and not be racist. Just because somebody's black doesn't make them right. Which, by the way, in Hurth logic here, has to be that if you do it anyway, that's your implicit bias telling you that you're racist. This is insanity. I was a minority at school, so I was the one that experienced racism. While everyone of every race holds prejudice and can discriminate against someone of another race in the U.S. or other white settler nations, only white people are in positions to oppress people of color collectively and throughout the whole society. This claim defies racism as a fluid dynamic that changes direction according to each group's ratio in a given space. While a white person may be picked upon, even mercilessly, by being in the numerical minority in a specific context, the individual is experiencing race prejudice and discrimination, not racism. Disagree totally with that definition, and that's insane. Because depending on where you're putting that population, where you're drawing your lines, you can always draw it that way for yourself. If a black person attacks a white person because of the color of their skin, that is racism by the definitions, at least the ones that we still have today. I know this book is trying to redefine it because it's trying to put power in there, but that's absolute bull. In the same way that if white people went to Africa, where the predominant group was black and they're in charge of everything, and murdered a black person because of the color of their skin, because they did not like them, that would be racist, even though black people are the ones in power and control. The nature that if black people attack a white person because of the color of their skin, and it's racial, that is racism. The fact that black people might see the person as an outgroup and terrify them, that's racist too. The distinction is not meant to minimize a white person's experience, but aims to clarify and prevent the rendering of the terms interchangeable and thus meaningless. Wrong. That you are absolutely doing that. You are minimizing that, and it's absolutely wrong to do. You are victimizing and not listening to people who went through that. And you are minimizing their experiences and trying to redefine it in you didn't experience racism. You just experienced prejudice. By the way, prejudice is a thought process, not an action. Being racist, there has to be an action involved. Racism is not just the feeling that somebody has of inferiority. It has to manifest in something. Sort of like you are at the back of the bus. I am not taking your resume. I am not. That the action is racist. Prejudice is the thought process behind it. And I'm sorry that you don't understand the difference between those two words. Moreover, the society at large is still reinforcing white supremacy, and everyone in the school is affected by it. It is likely that white students of such a school were treated better by teachers and higher expectations were held for them. Again, depending what school you went to and the teachers that were there. What if the teachers were all black? What would you say then? What if the principal was black? Oh, I forgot, you don't think there are any black principals. Which there are. Their textbooks, their curriculum, the administration still reinforce the preference for whiteness. Again, she has no idea what she's talking about. Outside the school and many aspects within it, the students were still granted white privilege as they moved through society. Well, depending where in society. For most whites, being the minority in a school or neighborhood is usually temporary. Yes, absolutely, because they just generally stay for short periods of time. They are probably no longer the minority in their environment, as upward mobility generally entails them moving away from the integrated spaces and those in which people of color are the majority. Again, she comes up with reasons and excuses why that's not the case, with no understanding of actually people that have no study to say anything about this, nor any understanding about it. My parents were not racist, and they taught me not to be racist. Whether you define racism as racial prejudice, as individual acts, or a system of racial inequality, the benefits that the whites are the expense of people of color, as anti-racists do. Your parents cannot have taught you not to be a racist, and your parents cannot be free from racism themselves. A racism-free upbringing is not possible, because racism is socially embedded in the culture and the institutions. Notice how she puts in the word anti-racism. Well, what's the difference between an anti-racist and somebody that's not racist? According to her definition, they're the same, because you can't escape it anyway. So if you're an anti-racist, you're still a racist, and therefore there's no point in being the anti-racist. Say I'm not racist, it's the same thing. A racism-free upbringing is not possible. Okay, we are born into a system and have no say whether it will be affected by it. I understand that many parents tell their children not to be racist, but the practice of our lives is more powerful than the words that we say, and living a segregated life is a powerful message or practice. Yes, I think that if you lived a segregated life and your parents taught you not to be racist, that yes, you might still have that. But if you didn't have a segregated life and your parents taught you not to be racist, you get a very different experience. Of course, there are degrees, and it's certainly more constructive to be told that racism is wrong than right. Wow, we agree. It is definitely taught that it's better to not be racist than racist. Very good. But it's still not enough to completely inculcate us from the culture at large. Let's imagine that the person really meant this. My parents were not racially prejudiced and taught me not to be racially prejudiced. This statement would still be false, because it's not humanly possible to be free of prejudice. I don't agree with her. You can be very much free of prejudice. You just don't ascribe to a group things. Now, does that mean that you understand reality or seeing things in reality? But the nature of saying that everybody has to be prejudiced is not true. This statement simply indicates that a person is uneducated about the socialization process and the inescapable dynamics of the human culture. A person's parents might have said that they were not prejudiced and thus denied their prejudice. They may have been told their children that you should not be prejudiced, and results being that, like the parents, the children deny their prejudice. The parents may have since hoped and believed that they were raising the children not to be prejudiced. But we can't teach humans to have no prejudice at all. The human brain just does not work that way, as we process information about others. I don't understand why processing information about others creates prejudice. Most of us only teach our children not to admit to prejudice. A parent teaching a child not to say certain things that are overly racial is teaching a child self-censorship. Rather than examine the deeply embedded racial messages, we are absorbed. Ideally, we teach our children how to recognize and challenge prejudice rather than deny it. I don't agree with that statement. You can absolutely help your children not be prejudiced, and one of the biggest proofs of that is interracial couples, because those people have no issue about marrying, loving, having children with, creating a life with somebody of a different race. The only way you could do that is if you don't have prejudice against that person. You're telling me they have prejudice against their wife? It doesn't make sense. As for the claim that children today are so much more open. Research over the past 2 decades indicates that children are vastly more sophisticated in their awareness of racial hierarchies than most people believe. Even when race is not explicitly discussed, children internalize both implicit and explicit messages about it from the environment. For example, psychology researcher Maria Monterrero, Delilah Del Franca, and Ricardo Rodriguez tested 238 white children aged 6 to 7 and 9 to 10. The children will ask to allocate money to white and black children, sometimes with a white adult in the room and sometimes with no adult in the room, to see if having an adult present influenced their behavior. The researcher found that the younger group discriminated against black children in both conditions, while the older group discriminated against black children only when the adult was present. This finding significantly indicates this finding is significant because it shows that older children clearly had racial prejudice and acted on it, but had hid it when the whites was present. Thus, the children show that they did not become less racially biased with age, but they had learned to hide their racism in front of adults. Monteiro and her colleagues found racial hostility in white children as young as 3 years old. However, most white parents and teachers believe that children are colorblind. This false belief keeps us from honestly addressing racism with children and exploring them how racism shaped the inequities that they also observe, that they already observe. I'm going to ask one question. Ready for this one? How then did the younger children have less of an issue in terms of that discrepancy? And how does the fact that people break into groups later on and how you see each other and how they interact with each other changes? And maybe that's part of the reason why. Because there is a preference for in-group as opposed to out-group. And the younger you are, you don't see those groups. And if you're less likely to see those groups, you're going to have less of an issue. Race has nothing to do with it. How often have you heard that somebody prefers a story about race with the statement, race has nothing to do with this but, or she just happens to be black and? Look closer and why the person feels it's necessary to make this opening point. Well, because of other people's perception. And it usually illustrates just the opposite. Just to help you out right now, I don't ever make those points in any of the statements that I say. The racist equals bad / not racist equals good binary is reflected in these statements because according to the binary, if race had anything to do with it, the person who tells a story would racially, implicitly, and thus no longer positioned as colorblind and outside race. Further, if the story is about conflict between the storyteller and a person of color, then the storyteller might sound racist, and that would mean that the speaker is a bad person. Yes. I think if the person is racist, and yes, that would be a bad quality in that person. If, however, the speaker understands racism as an institutional system into which we all socialize, then the speaker would make the disclaimer, understanding that the conflict can be free of racial dimensions. Oh yes, I love to be part of racism, and I don't care that we're all racist. Great. We have nothing else to do anymore. We could just accept it and live with it. But of course, that's not what she says. We bring our racial histories with us, and contrary to the ideology of individualism, we represent our groups and those come before us. I reject that statement. I am not part of a group collective. I am not Borg. Okay? I am an individual. I don't represent a group. If I commit a murder, it's not my group committed a murder. It's I did it. And the nature of the behaviors that I do are my responsibility, not my group's. Our identities are not unique or inherent, but constructed as produced through social processes, which more we don't see through color, clear, or objective eyes. We see through racial lenses. On some level, race is always at play, even if it's supposed absence. Focusing on race is what divides us. The idea that talking about racism in itself is racist has always struck me as odd. It is rooted in the concept that race doesn't matter. Let's talk about it gives it undeserved weight. Many things that we talk about every day don't really matter, precisely because the topics of conversation doesn't matter. They're easy to talk about. We know race matters a great deal, but for many of the reasons already discussed, we feel they need to deny its importance. Ironically, this denial is a fundamental way in which white people maintain unequal racial power. I discuss race all the time. I have no problem discussing it. The difference is I don't ascribe any individual attributes to race. I don't say because somebody is this race, therefore they are. Because I don't believe in group ideology. That does not state that I can't talk about race. I've heard this response many times in the context of cross-racial discussions. Most often, at a point in which racial power is named, many whites see naming the white racial power as divisive. For them, the problem is not power inequity itself. The problem is naming the power inequity. No, I would have a problem if white power was an issue. I do have a problem with that. If you could point to a policy that leads to that happening, we absolutely should correct it. Again, very much would like to see things change in our legal system and the way that police are trained and the nature by which they deal with certain things. I think that police in general treat people at times with incredible disrespect. I've seen it, and I've been involved in situations like that. Again, with both black and white people. Even though participants of color repeatedly state that whites' refusal to acknowledge racial differences of power dynamics actually maintains racial inequality, white participants continue to insist not talking about differences is necessary for unity. Although the participants are supposedly engaged in the discussion to explore differences in racial perspectives and experiences, as soon as those differences appear, many whites react as this has been a violation. Of course, white norms are violated by naming white power, but equal power relations cannot be challenged if they're not acknowledged. Refusing to engage in authentic exploration of racial realities erases and denies alternate racial experiences. If we block others' realities by not discussing them, we can pretend they don't exist. No, I actually know they exist. As I mentioned before, there's a racial disparity between Russians and English in the amount of money they have. Now, why is that? Is it because of systematic racism? Now, those disparities exist. But what do we do about them? That's a separate question. You first have to understand them. But this book doesn't do anything to understand them. It just labels everything as racism. Not talking about race allows us to maintain our sense of ourselves and unique individual outside collective socializations and group experiences. While it isn't comfortable for most whites to talk about racism, we must do so if we want to challenge rather than project racism. To avoid talking about racism can only hold our misinformation in place and prevent us from developing necessary skills and perspectives to challenge the status quo. One of the things I always noticed, Miss DiAngelo will never ever accept a debate or discussion because she can't. Because if she does, she'll get blown out of the water with something called facts. Larry Elder would absolutely destroy her in any form of talking about reality in terms of this. Most of us alive before and during the 1960s have the images that civil rights conflicts of the time held up as the epitome of racism. Today, no, first of all, 1960s was not the epitome of racism, slavery was. The 1960s came about because of the Jim Crow laws of a particular party in this country that tried to reclaim and restate a lot of that segregation because of racial hate. And the sad part is that was around for a long period of time. Today we have images of white nationalists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia to hold up. And while speaking up against these explicit racist actions is critical, we also must be careful not to use them to keep ourselves as the good side of the false binary. No, the reason why we speak out against them is because they want things that are absolutely racist to go back to ways that were before, and we don't believe that. Racism is so deeply woven into the fabric of our society, I don't see myself escaping from that continuum in my lifetime. How wonderful. So we are going to be racist forever, according to her. But I can continually seek to move further along it. Move further along what? Just acknowledging what you've done, saying I'm wrong? Beautiful. You keep doing that. I am not in a fixed position on the continuum. My position is dictated by what I'm actually doing at a given time. Well, how does that happen? Conceptualizing myself on an active continuum changes the question for whether am I or not racist to a more constructive question. I'm actively seeking to interpret racism in this context. And even more importantly, how do I know? That ends chapter 5, which we will do again chapter 6, starting anti-blackness. But the aspect is, if she's going to constantly ask herself if everything is racist, she will fall in line that seeing everything is racist because of her own inability to see things objectively. She will subjectively see racism in everything. Everything becomes then racist, based upon a subjective thought process of seeing everything through that prism. So therefore, a white person bumps into a black person, it must have been racism. A person gets into a conflict with a black person, it must be racism. Everything that happens between a white and black person must be racism. And that's the problem with this binary. With her continuum, It creates this idea that everything must be seen through the lens of race. But every action isn't racist. Everything isn't seen in the color of race. There are people out there that are just bad people that do bad things. Whoever's in front of them is going to get it. And that's just the nature of us as human beings. Again, if you like this video, hit like. If you disliked it, please tell me why. And again, I welcome if you did, but just tell me why. And again, if you'd like to share this video with other people who might find this interesting, hit subscribe to the station if you haven't. And of course, if you'd like to become a patron, you can hit the Subcribe-star and donate. I thank you very much. Have a good night and good mental health.